Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Merlin's Season 1, Episode 4, The Poisoned Chalice. The episode in a nutshell is a short summary that tells us exactly what happens within this episode. Merlin drinks poison in Arthur's place, leading to Arthur going on a quest to get the antidote in time as Nimue tries to stop Arthur from succeeding. We'll now get into a more detailed summary and give our opinions as we go. So we rejoin Nimue in her cave. Nimue drips blood from her finger into her basin, all while she's chanting. This brings up an image of Merlin polishing Arthur's armor. She then dips a petal into the basin, which turns it from yellow to transparent, while she still continues to chant. Once she's done, she pulls the petal out of the basin and puts it into a chalice while saying Merlin's name. Once again, we know the bad guy we're rooting against right in the first scene, and I personally love this scene just for the atmosphere that it brings. But obviously, we now know this is where the episode gets its name. She is poisoning a chalice. We now follow a train of blue-cloaked knights who arrive at Camelot to beating of drums. And then it switches and we see two entourages walk toward the center of the throne room, one side red and one side blue, while Uther greets Bayard, who is king of Mercia, stating that the treaty they signed that day marks the end to war and the beginning of a new friendship. They shake arms. Nimue watches Merlin from the side as she has now disguised herself as a servant of Bayard. Obviously, in this scene, we see that Nimue has infiltrated the kingdom and has become very fixated on Merlin, who is obviously completely oblivious to her presence. And then it has to be noted that whole two entourages meeting in the center to grasp arms. It's very aesthetic, the swirling cloaks, the two colors, and the wind in Bayard's hair is a little bit longer, so he's got like the wind in his hair as he and his entourage saunter into the middle of that room. And Uther comes from the other side with his entourage. It's all very aesthetic. Now that the villain for the episode has been fully set up, we now return to being with Merlin, who passes Gaius in the hallway while he's carrying a heavy bag of what seems like laundry. He takes a moment to complain to Gaius, but Gaius says that he's a servant, it's what he does, and he calls having to carry heavy objects and do all these chores character building. He then makes up a proverb on the spot about hard work breeding a harder soul. Merlin, of course, catches him out on this and says there's no way that that's a proverb, just as Nimue happens to trip in front of him. He bends down to help her, and they lock eyes, and he seems immediately taken with her. Smiling, helping her pick up the items that she was carrying, he introduces himself as Merlin, and she gives him her alias, Kara, when she introduces herself to him in turn. She comments on him being Arthur's servant, and he says someone's got to keep the place running. She thanks him for his help and notices that he's still holding a pillow. And then he quickly scrambles to give it back to her. And she says that it was nice meeting him before leaving, and he watches her as she goes. Gaius, who was standing there for the whole thing, asks him, "Shouldn't you be busy running the place?" Before he laughs. Nimue, meanwhile, breaks into Bayard's rooms and swaps out one of the ceremonial goblets, the one meant for Arthur, for the one that she had spilled and poisoned at the beginning of the episode. Now, obviously, it seems Merlin has a little bit of a crush on Nimue in this episode. In the first meeting, he's very stunned, very awestruck, can't even remember that he's holding a pillow that he has to give back to her because he's just so taken with her. And in another universe where she wasn't evil, I think they'd be amazing. But unfortunately, she's evil. And then we talked in some of the previous episodes about secondhand embarrassment. Gaius has pretty much established himself as somewhat of a grandparently figure for Merlin at this point, and he was there watching the whole thing. Merlin flirting badly, Merlin making a little bit of a fool of himself. I got secondhand embarrassment from that. I was like, oh, maybe not the time. But after his encounters with Nimue and Gaius, Merlin now makes it to Arthur's room. Merlin and Arthur pull out his clothes for the feast, which Merlin comments smell like the last feast ended in a food fight. And then Merlin asks when the ceremonial robes were last washed, to which Arthur replies that it was probably last year, sometime before the Feast of Beltane. Merlin comments on the airs and graces of the court being a complete mystery to him, and then Arthur informs him that he'll be going to the feast, before smirking. And then he shows him the ceremonial robes of the servants of Camelot. Merlin frowns and says he can't be serious, but Arthur just smirks harder. Obviously, we get a little bit more of the Merlin-Arthur teasing, or rather Arthur teasing Merlin, and we get to find out that Merlin's going to the feast, and he's obviously going to be wearing an embarrassing outfit. And then we are proven right. Merlin goes to the ceremony where Bayard signs the treaty, and he is wearing a ridiculous feathered hat. The robes themselves aren't that bad, it's what you would expect, but the hat gives all the secondhand embarrassment you could ever want, that he has to wear that hat in public. And of course, Gwen, who's next to him, he looks at her and she can't hold in her chuckles because it's a ridiculous hat. But she tells him that it's a nice hat, and he thanks her, shaking her head at Arthur, who's still glancing over at him and smirking every time. He then catches Nimue's eye from across the room, and he takes the hat off while fixing his hair because he wants to make a good impression on her. Gwen notices and comments on how pretty Nimue is, and he confirms that she's pretty for a princess, let alone a handmaiden. Gwen hums while Uther takes his turn to sign the treaty, before they grasp arms again as the crowd applauds. Gwen, obviously upset that Merlin thinks Nimue is pretty, moves away to stand by Gaius instead of him as Bayard starts to give his speech and presents the ceremonial goblets to Uther and Arthur. As the speech continues, Nimue approaches Merlin and, in a worried tone, says she doesn't know who else to tell, but doesn't want to speak in the room, and they leave together. Gaius notices that they leave, and then in the hallway, Nimue informs Merlin of a sob story about seeing Bayard put poison in Arthur's goblet, saying if Arthur dies, then Uther's spirit will break and Camelot will fall. Merlin believes her without a second thought and hurries back while she smirks behind him. In the hall, Bayard is still giving a long-winded speech. And then there are several trick endings where Bayard seems to end, but then Uther speaks up, and then that seems to end, and so on, where Arthur almost drinks, but then just in time, he doesn't, because they've tricked him with another ending. And then, just in time before Arthur was really going to drink, Merlin returns and accuses Bayard of poisoning Arthur's goblet. Bayard, of course, having no idea what's going on, denies it, and Arthur tries to cover for Merlin. Nimue watches from around the corner, still pleased with herself. Merlin, when he's questioned, says that he has a source, but he refuses to name it. And Uther takes the goblet, and at first he wants to give it to Bayard, saying, if it's not poisoned, then you should have no problem drinking from it. But then he decides, you know what? If it is poisoned, I want to be the one to kill you myself. So instead of giving it to Bayard, who potentially had poisoned it, he decides that he is going to give it to Merlin to drink. Arthur, of course, protests that Merlin will die if it's poisoned, but Uther obviously doesn't care about a servant. We established that in the last episode. Or not the last episode. In Valiant, we established that he doesn't care about servants. And then Bayard asks What if Merlin lives? And Uther says, then Bayard can do whatever he wants with him. Arthur tells Merlin to apologize for his mistake, but Merlin says that he is going to drink it, and he does so. At first, he seems to be fine, and Gaius and Gwen sigh in relief, and Uther says, "He's yours," to Bayard. But then Merlin starts grasping at his throat and collapses. Uther then has the guards seize Bayard and his men, saying that it was in fact poisoned, as Arthur, Gaius, and Gwen crowd over Merlin, and Gaius says they need to get him to his chambers, reminding them to grab the goblet as they go, so that he can identify the poison. Arthur picks Merlin up and carries him from the hall, with Gwen grabbing the goblet as she follows. Now, obviously, I feel really bad for Bayard. He's here, he's signing a treaty, everything seems to be going well for him and his country. They're moving forward in friendship with Camelot. A war that apparently has been going on and behind the scenes is now over. And then, because of some sorceress's weird fixation, he is now framed for murder. I have a servant. His treaty's out, down the toilet, down the drain. And then, maybe I'm a bad friend, but I cannot imagine having any sort of friendship strong enough or feeling strong enough for a friend that I would willingly do something that I knew would kill me to save their life. Like, obviously, if you're in a burning building, you grab them on the way out because, of course, they're your friend and you want to help them. But if you know, sure thing, that you are most likely to die if you do this thing, like, for example, a poison chalice and you know it's poisoned, drinking that poison on their behalf, I personally could never. I could never do that. And maybe that makes me a bad friend. But Merlin doesn't know what the poison is. He doesn't know whether an antidote exists or if one can be found. He doesn't know whether the poison is slow acting or fast acting, and yet he willingly chooses to drink the poison for Arthur, for his friend, and it's just unbelievable because I don't feel that most people, I feel, would do that. We now arrive back at Gaius's chambers, or rather the first time in Gaius's chambers in this episode, and Gaius gives us, or not gives us, gives orders for Arthur to lay Merlin on the bed, while telling Gwen to go and get some water and a towel. Arthur asks if Merlin's going to be all right, and Gwen asks if he can be cured. Gaius says that he has to identify the poison in order to know, asking for the goblet, which Gwen gives him. He quickly finds the transparent petals stuck to the inside, while Gwen turns to Merlin and notes that he happens to be having a rather high fever. Gaius, quickly on his first try, finds the exact book that has the exact flower and turns to the exact page in that book that has that flower on it and informs them that the petal comes from the Mortius flower. And Merlin can only be saved by a potion made from the leaf of the Mortius flower, which only grows on the roots of the Mortius tree, which is found in the caves beneath the forest of either Bela or Balak. I couldn't understand what Gaius was saying there. Going on to say that there are cockatrice guards in the forest, which has venom potent enough that a drop of it means certain death, and that few who have ever searched for the flower have ever made it back alive. After a few moments of thought, Arthur says that it sounds like fun, and he makes to leave, but Gaius warns that it's too dangerous for a prince. And Arthur asks what happens to Merlin without the antidote. Gaius, of course, says he's going to die within 4, maybe 5 days, and without another word, Arthur leaves. And this is why they are best friends, Merlin and Arthur. Very little hesitation for Arthur to help him, even when others are warning him against it. He's like, if I don't go, what happens to my bestie? And when it's death, it's, then I'm leaving anyways. And he walks out, and he's determined, and he's going to go and save his bestie. And I love that. We then get Nimue strutting dramatically down the hallway as her cloak billows around her with a smirk on her face before we then see her riding out of the castle, escaping. Goal achieved. Gwen arrives in Morgana's room apologizing for being late to attend her, and Morgana asks about Merlin. And Gwen says that if Arthur gets the antidote on time, Merlin will be fine. And Morgana, with all the confidence in the world in Arthur, says then he'll be fine. She then dismisses Gwen so that she can go and help Merlin, as she knows what he means to her. And Gwen thanks her before leaving while Morgana pulls the clips from her hair. Arthur is suited up to go on his antidote quest, but Uther arrives and forbids him from going, as he is his only son and heir, and he won't risk him for a mere serving boy. Arthur asks if Merlin's life is worthless, and Uther says that it's not worth less, but it is worth less than Arthur's. Arthur then asks again for men, promising that he'll succeed, but Uther says that he won't jeopardize the kingdom's future over Merlin, as once he's dead, the kingdom will still need a king. Arthur says that he can't watch Merlin die, and Uther tells him not to look, saying that Merlin won't be the last to die for him, so he'll just have to get used to it. Arthur says that Uther can't stop him, and Uther says he's not leaving the castle, putting an end to it. Arthur returns to his rooms and throws his sword on the table, obviously upset that he's not allowed to go and save his best friend. Morgana arrives to give Arthur a little bit of a pep talk, asking what kind of king Camelot would want. One that risks his life for a lowly servant, or one that does what his father tells him to. Arthur then rides out of the castle, knocking over the guards that try to stop him, while Nimue watches all of it from her scrying basin. Obviously, I love the whole dramatic walk out of the palace with the cloak swirling. They do that a lot in the show, a lot of dramatic strutting down the halls in really nice outfits. Uther isn't wrong, even though he is an a-hole and we are totally meant to hate him at this point. Again, I'll reiterate that a good ruler isn't always a good person. Sometimes you have to balance the scales and make a tough choice. It's just, while emotionally horrible, logically, it makes sense. Arthur is a prince, the only prince, the heir. If he dies, after Uther's gone, the kingdom is left without a ruler, without a leader. That is a lot worse than one servant dying. But of course, what Uther fails to understand is that this servant happens to be his son's best friend, and so his son is obviously going to go to bat for him and go to save him. It was an oversight on Uther's part. In Gaius's chambers, Gwen is still tending to Merlin and comments that Merlin's getting a little bit worse. And then Merlin starts muttering spells in his sleep and saying Arthur's name. Gwen asks about the language, but Gaius lies and says, oh, it's just random noises caused by the fever. Gaius then notices that Merlin's pulse is weaker than it was before and finds a rash on his arm that appeared too soon, as that should be one of the ending stages of the poison. They then realize that the poison was sped up by an enchantment, which Bayard couldn't possibly have performed. And Gaius then makes the connection before saying that she wouldn't come here, obviously implying Nimue, before sending Gwen to go and find Nimue amongst the servants of Bayard that are in the dungeons. Gwen arrives in the dungeons, looks into all of the cells where Bayard's entourage is being kept, but she doesn't find her. Obviously, in this episode, we're upping the stakes and the tension. The poison has been sped up. Arthur doesn't have as much time as he thinks in order to save Merlin, and Nimue has now infiltrated. We know Bayard's innocent, at least on the side of Gaius, but we now don't know where the actual culprit is because, as we as the audience know, she's already long gone and escaped. Again with the whole, so obviously this time it's not Merlin's fault, but literally in public, there in the bed, muttering spells under his breath. And then Arthur's name. Thank goodness Gwen has no knowledge about magic at all, because otherwise, that could have been a death sentence right there. I mean, he's already dying, but that could have been a let's make sure of it death sentence right there. Uther has come into Morgana's rooms to complain about Arthur defying him. She, of course, as the one who convinced him to go, defends Arthur's decision, but Uther keeps saying that Arthur's still a child. He can't make these types of decisions. He can't do these things for himself. But Morgana says that he needs to see Arthur as he is, that he is grown up. He has to let him make his decisions. While Uther asks, even if it means letting him go to his death? And then Nimue, of course, is spying on Arthur, who's reaching the forest and pulling up her hood while leaving her cave. Obviously, in this scene, we get Uther complaining to Morgana. Morgana's the one that made Arthur go, so she's completely unsympathetic to him. And obviously, we get to see that Uther still thinks of Arthur as a younger child than he is, incapable of making his own decisions. And that may be why he's so strict with him, why he orders him around so much. And Morgana's trying to get him to see that Arthur has grown up, at least to a certain extent, and should be allowed to explore making his own decisions so that he can face the consequences of them and grow as a person, I would assume. In Gaius's chambers, Gaius is examining Merlin's rash, which doesn't seem to have changed, as Gwen arrives back to report that no one has seen Kara since the banquet. Gwen then asks who she is, and Gaius informs her that Kara isn't her real name, and she's a powerful sorceress. Gwen suggests that they send out riders, but Gaius says that she'll be long gone before realizing that she'll know the antidote and the only place it can be found, noting that Arthur could very well be walking into a trap as they speak. And then Merlin, once again, starts saying Arthur's name in his sleep. And I do wonder, like, because he keeps muttering spells, he keeps saying Arthur's name, I wonder what's going on in Merlin's head. Like, is he doing a form of scrying while he's unconscious? Is that the spell that he's using to scry for Arthur, who's off on a trip? Obviously, we're going to find out by the end of the episode, but this is when we first start to think maybe he's scrying since he keeps repeating Arthur's name, and while they're best friends, I don't know that they're so close that he's going to be muttering his name for any other reason. We now watch Arthur walk his horse through the woods, and a cockatrice watches him from beneath a log. He pauses at the top of a hill in order to look down at the frog-shrouded landscape beneath, and then he has to get to the bottom of the hill. And when he gets to the bottom of the hill, Nimue is crying on a log. She has a wound on her arm. He asks her if she's all right, but just then a cockatrice comes roaring over the hill at them, or a cliff. He tells her to stay back and faces the cockatrice with a lot of sword flipping and swinging at the air. He literally doesn't touch it at all. He doesn't even come close. There's at least like a foot between his sword and the cockatrice. Before he decides that obviously his ineffectual swinging is doing nothing, and he throws the blade to kill it. The blade, of course, happens to hit him right in the heart, and I wonder again if Merlin's little muttered spells maybe helped with that. Once he's killed it, he turns back to Nimue to try to see if she is safe, and she backs away all skittishly and afraid of him. Arthur tells her that he's not going to hurt her, asking where her wounds are from, and she presents a sob story about being a runaway from a cruel master who has hurt her, and having nowhere to go, and he can't leave her. She then asks Arthur to leave the woods with her, but he says that he has something he needs to do first while looking toward the caves. She offers to help him out, and he tells her that he's after the Mortius flower, and she offers to show him where they are, as she's familiar with the area. Arthur and Nimue then enter the caves with torches together. Now, obviously, it's absolutely hilarious. I think they were meaning to be serious, but literally, Arthur's just swinging his sword at the air for like a good couple of like at least a good minute before he decides to throw it at the cockatrice, and he makes like no wounds in the meantime. He does a lot of like dramatic sword flipping, like sword tricks, but he doesn't hit the thing. Now, this could just be again because the effects at that time, maybe they couldn't have him actually stabbing it at that time, and that's why they had him just swing at the air before throwing the sword. But it looks ridiculous when he's just swinging at the air and hitting nothing. And we as the audience can see that he's hitting nothing. There's like I said, it looks like there's like a good foot between him and the cockatrice. And then of course the cockatrice is just like obviously not getting close to him either. So it looks like it's just posturing and being all like aggressive and stuff. But again, no one's hitting it until of course he throws the sword and it gets hit. But that's just a very funny scene. And then with Nimue's sob story, I don't think I mentioned it in the summary I was doing, but she mentions that she was lost. She ran away from her master. She got lost. Now she's in the woods. She doesn't want him to leave her. But as soon as he mentions, oh, I need to get that Mortius flower, she's like, oh, I'm familiar with this area. Let me show you where it is. You just said you were lost. And of course, that goes right over Arthur's head because he doesn't notice at all that she had said she was lost and now she's saying she can show him. He's not suspicious at all. Still unconscious, Merlin tells Arthur that he is walking into a trap, while Gwen and Gaius watch over him at his side. He then starts chanting even more spells in his sleep, and Gaius is a bit worried and sends Gwen away for more herbs. Once she's left, he then leans closer to Merlin and tells him that he must fight it. Obviously, at this point, we're well aware that Merlin's doing something in his sleep. I think he's doing some form of scrying, and therefore he's watching Arthur, and now Arthur's with Nimue. And so he knows now that it's a trap, and that's why he's murmuring it out loud and casting other spells. But while I can think like maybe the first spell was scrying, maybe the second spell he did was helping Arthur aim his sword to kill the cockatrice and have it land absolutely perfectly in the beast. At this point, I'm not sure what these spells he's doing are. Because the next spell that we can see Arthur benefiting from isn't happening right now. So I am curious what he thinks he's doing, whether that's just renewing and strengthening the scrying spells or if there are other spells. Obviously, because they're in a different language, I can't tell if any of them are the same or not, or what their intended purpose is. Nimue and Arthur have now made their way into the cave system, and they're now at a deep gorge with a little bit of a cliff overhang in front of it, and then on the other side, way up high, is the Mortius flower, and Nimue points it out to Arthur. Arthur, with again very little hesitation, starts to make his way over the outcrop, and then Nimue begins chanting. She drops her axe, she starts chanting. We then see that some of the bottom of the outcrop gives way, and Arthur then notices what she's doing, and obviously he's like, what are you doing? But she keeps her chanting up, and he ends up having to jump the gap, just as the rest of the outcrop gives way. He manages to catch the edge, and as he's hanging there, a large spider appears. Of course, he manages to, while holding on with one arm, which is very impressive, especially since he also is wearing armor, which will add some weight to the body weight, manages to grab his sword out and kill the spider. He yells at Nimue, asking who she is, and she says she's the last face he'll ever see. Then they notice that there's a few more spiders coming, and she says that she'll let the spiders finish him. saying that it's not his destiny to die by her hand. And then she walks away, leaving him in the dark. Merlin then, back in Gaius's chamber, says it's too dark before he chants yet another spell and creates an orb of light in his hand. The orb then also appears in the cave, which gives Arthur light to light his path. Of course, at first he's suspicious. He's just been a victim of sorcery, taking away the outcrop. So he's yelling at it, thinking that it's there to finish him off. But when the light does nothing more than light his way, he then dismisses it, pulls himself up, and starts looking to where the flowers are. Merlin, who is in his sleep watching this somehow, most likely scrying in his sleep, says to just leave them, to save himself. But as Arthur can't hear him, he glances at the oncoming spiders, and then up to the flower, and then back at the spiders. Merlin tells him to follow the light, but instead Arthur climbs sideways and towards where the flowers are, and he does in fact manage to get one before the spiders are reaching him. He then follows the light and manages to escape the caves and the spiders, who, even though it's dark outside, don't follow him out of the cave. Now Nimue, she tells Arthur, it's not your destiny to die by my hand. So, obviously, he has a destiny to die by someone's hand. So why does she think that the spiders are going to succeed here? When she already knows, being a sorceress and knowing all of these mystical prophecies surrounding the once and future king, that it's not the spiders that are destined to kill him either. Why does she think she's going to succeed here? But in any case, she doesn't succeed. Arthur does get out, and he gets out by following an orb of light. Now, I remember when I first saw this series, when it first came out, obviously all of the effects were new at the time, and I remember that this scene always was so mystical looking, and it was one of the scenes that I remembered the most and that I really liked in the series, similar to in the first episode with the singer. This was probably my second favorite, and again, it happens in the first season. But now that I'm rewatching it, now that we know effects have come so much farther, it really wasn't as mystical as I had remembered it being. But it still was very pretty. The orb was very nice. Having succeeded in his mission, Arthur rides up to Camelot and is spotted by the guards. Sir Gregory, who we had met in episode 1, orders that Uther be informed. Arthur's way is then blocked, and Gregory informs him that he's under arrest by order of the king. We then find Arthur in the dungeons. Uther confronts Arthur for disobeying him. And Arthur says that of course he did. A man's life was at stake. Uther asks why he cares so much. And Arthur, not able to admit that it's because he's his best friend, tells him that Merlin knew that the poison was the chalice was poisoned, and what would happen when he drank from it. And he drank from it anyways. He also tells Uther about Nimue, saying that he doesn't think Bayard was trying to poison him, but that this woman was. Uther refuses to listen to Arthur, and when Arthur tries to give him the flower so that he can get it to Gaius in time, Uther decides to crush it in his hand instead, saying that he'll let him out in a week so that he can find a new servant. Now, I have defended Uther on many occasions. I've given him a bit of grace, because he is a leader and he has to make those tough choices. So even though some of the choices he made may be emotionally unpopular, logically they did make sense for the welfare of his kingdom and for the welfare of the majority of his citizens, whom it's his responsibility to take care of. But in this scene, in this case, there is no excuse. There is no logical or emotional reason why he wouldn't save Merlin now that he has the flower. Yes, punish Arthur, ground him, leave him in the dungeons for a week, leave him in the dungeon for 2 weeks, let him be punished. But that doesn't mean he has to let Merlin, who is completely innocent, who has saved his son's life for the second time, to die when the means to his being saved is right there in his hand. He has no excuse for that. None. No grace can be given. He is heinous, and that is all we're going to say about Uther in this. Back in Gaius's chambers, Merlin is still struggling to breathe. He's having a very hard time. The poison is progressing. And Gaius comments that he doesn't have much longer. He then asks Gwen if Arthur got the flower. Gwen says that Uther won't let anyone see Arthur, but says that she's going to try to sneak in. Gwen then brings a plate of food to Arthur, who has her put it on the table in his cell. Before she can leave, however, he goes over to the plate. He picks up some of the food and then tells her to take it away as it isn't fit for anyone to eat, let alone a prince. She then goes over to the plate, picks it up, looks down, and sees the flower tucked in with the rest of the food. She then leaves the dungeons, and as she is leaving, she's stopped by a guard, and obviously this makes her very nervous, but he just takes some bread from her. And then she quickly starts to make her escape, but has to appear unhurried so that she doesn't raise suspicions. However, just as she's going up the stairs, the maid bringing Arthur's real meal is coming down the stairs. When that maid arrives with food for Arthur, the guard realizes that they've all been tricked and yells after Gwen, but she's far enough away that she is able to grab the flower from the plate and run away and run straight back to Gaius. As soon as she arrives in Gaius's room, she gives him the flower, and Gaius says that Merlin is much worse and begins concocting the antidote as Gwen sits by Merlin's side. Gaius stops his mortar and pestling, his mashing up of the leaf, and Gwen asks why he's stopping, and he says that because the poison was made with magic, the antidote may also need it. But then she freaks out and says that's forbidden. They can't do magic. Even if it saves someone's life, that's not allowed. So then he tells her he'll make it work without it. And then conveniently, in the next line, sends Gwen away for more water. He then uses a magic spell on the potion, which makes it froth and sizzle. And Gwen returns with the water, and Gaius thanks her before adding the water to the potion and then bringing the potion over to Merlin. They force it into Merlin's throat by holding his nose and massaging his throat. But unfortunately, Merlin stops breathing. And then, when they lay their ear against his chest, they realize his heart has also stopped. Gaius and Gwen play the blame game together, saying what they could have done better, what they should have done instead. They should have been faster. They should have gotten it made quicker. They should have done this. They should have done that. And while they're having their... And of course, Gwen is hugging Gaius and crying, and they're completely in their own little blame game world. Merlin comes back to life. He sits up a bit and he tells them that it's disgusting and that Gaius is old enough to be her grandfather. And Gwen, of course, thrilled and happy, rushes to his side in order to kiss him, apologizing after saying that she thought he was dead. Merlin then says that he's fine and that the last thing he remembers is drinking the wine. So he obviously doesn't remember anything that he had seen or done while he was unconscious under the poison and crying. Obviously, it's a fun little sneaky way that they get the flower in order to use the magic. Obviously, we were meant to really be sad that Merlin died. We were supposed to feel tension. We were probably supposed to feel sad. But here's the thing. If Merlin had actually died, I feel like the emotional impact would have been successful. But Merlin is the main character. So he's probably not going to die. Additional to being the main character who's probably not going to die, this is episode 4. Now, it may have been successful at the end of season 1 if we didn't know it was renewed for season 2 and Merlin ended up almost dying, we would believe maybe he actually did. Maybe they were ending the show badly, like sadly, tragically. And so that maybe would have been more believable, and that maybe would have been able to get us. But this is episode 4. We know there's a whole season, so even the first time it was airing, the first time you watched it, you knew there was no way they were killing off Merlin. So you obviously didn't grieve for Merlin at all because, well, he's going to be back and we know it. Whether that was going to happen right away or they had to do another quest for that to happen, that was anybody's guess at the time. But there wasn't really any sort of like emotional impact to his death because we knew he wouldn't die. We now have Gaius interrupting a council session where Uther and his knights are planning how to counter Mercia, who has found out about their king's arrest and is obviously wanting to attack them soon. Gaius tells him that what he has to say will have a bearing on the plans that he's making, and says that he knows who tried to poison Arthur. Uther says they all know who tried to poison Arthur, and that was Bayard. But Gaius corrects him and says it wasn't Bayard, but Nimue. Uther, of course, is in disbelief, doesn't want it to be Nimue, but Gaius explains that the poison had magic in it, and he would recognize that magical signature anywhere. Uther still denies the possibility, saying that they would have remembered her face. But Gaius reminds him that as a powerful sorceress, she can enchant the eye that beholds her, and she may have changed her appearance. Uther asks if he has any proof, and Gaius again mentions the magic that made the poison more potent. Uther asks if there's any chance she conspired with Bayard, but Gaius says that Bayard is completely innocent, and her goal was to bring war and strife to Camelot, as she hates Camelot and she hates Uther. Uther orders all of his knights to stand down, and Gaius encourages him, saying that he's doing the right thing. Uther, of course, goes and slumps on his throne, upset about Nimue, and Gaius asks him if Arthur should be told the truth of Nimue, but the scene ends without us getting an answer. Again, we're bringing up the connection between Nimue and Uther. We're still not being told what that connection is exactly, but we now are fully aware that one exists. And we also are brought in on the fact that it also includes Arthur somehow, as Gaius is saying that Arthur should be told, or asking if Arthur will be told. But again, they're rudely keeping us as the audience in the dark. We now have Uther, Morgana, and Arthur standing on the battlements, on the wall, watching as Bayard and his men ride away from Camelot. Obviously, everything is reconciled, they're leaving peacefully, and Morgana and Arthur are off to the side, and Morgana tells him that he can brag now because they're alone and everything has turned out well. But instead of bragging, he tells her that he had help, and whoever sent the light saved his life. She encourages him, she empathizes, she sympathizes, and then she leaves. And Uther comes over to Arthur. He then asks what the woman in the forest had told Arthur. Arthur, of course, says that she didn't say much, as she was too busy trying to have him killed, though he does reveal that she said it wasn't his destiny to die by her hand. Uther then takes the opportunity to reiterate to Arthur that all magic is evil, and it destroys goodness wherever it is found. Arthur then says it sounds like he knows her, and Uther looks like he maybe is going to say something, but instead he does say something, but maybe not what he was originally going to say. And he says that he does know her. But instead of telling the truth about who Nimue is and what the connection is, he says instead that to know one sorcerer is to know them all. Before saying even though Arthur disobeyed him, he's still proud of him, and then pats his shoulder before the scene ends. Obviously, in this episode, we get a couple of hearts to hearts. We get Arthur and Morgana, and then we get Arthur and Uther reconciling. Obviously, Uther's being a bit weak in this one. He has a connection to Nimue. The connection obviously includes Arthur. Nimwe's now made 2 attempts on the kingdom to cause widespread strife. She sent a plague, she tried to start a war, but she's also targeted Arthur directly, which obviously means that Arthur is involved, and working with limited information is never a good thing. Especially if you want to have success in any sort of operation, you need all of the information, as much information as you can get, so that you can come up with the appropriate plan. So Uther withholding this information is obviously a bad decision, but whatever the connection between him and Nimue is, obviously he doesn't want to share it, and instead of stepping up and doing so, he instead is taking the easy way and deciding to keep it to himself. But honestly, if he was going to tell him at any time, his reputation with Arthur is already kind of down the drain. It's already in the pits, in the mud. So he's not going to make his reputation with his son any worse at this point. So if any time was the time to tell him, it probably would be at this point. But as they now have just reconciled, it's unlikely we're going to find out what that connection is. And now we come up to the end of our episode. Arthur arrives in Gaius's chambers in order to check on Merlin, who's eating dinner with a blanket wrapped around him. Arthur comments on Merlin being alive, and Merlin says that he understands he has him to thank for that. Arthur tells him that it was nothing, and a half-decent servant is hard to find, and he expects him to be back at work tomorrow. Merlin says that he'll be there bright and early, and Arthur makes to leave when Merlin calls to him and tells him thank you. Arthur says you too, telling him to get some rest before leaving. Gaius comes over to join Merlin for dinner, saying that Arthur may give him a hard time, but there aren't many who'd risk what he did for a servant. Merlin says it wouldn't have mattered if Gaius couldn't make the antidote. Merlin comments that he doesn't understand why Nimue went through the trouble of framing Bayard, and Gaius comments that she knew he would drink the wine. He informs Merlin that he was the true target all along, and it seems that someone else knows he's destined for great things. Merlin contemplates, and his image shows up in Nimue's basin, and then she glances up at the camera. Now, it was a bit disappointing at how awkward the scene between Merlin and Arthur was, given what they both went through for each other. Merlin almost dying, having drinking poison on his behalf, and Arthur going through this whole quest to save him. I especially hate how Merlin kind of discredits Arthur's role in it by saying, well, it wouldn't have meant anything if Arthur brought back the flower if you weren't here to fix it, like to make the antidote. It's like they worked together, they collaborated. Don't discredit Arthur's role. And then, of course, there is the fact that Gaius points out that Nimue knew what Merlin would do, that Merlin was the target, and Nimue obviously knows that Merlin has a great destiny coming up and is trying to stop him for some reason. And of course, in the summary, it can't come off the way it does on screen, which is why it's always important to rewatch the series. But when Nimue is watching in the basin, that moment between Gaius and Merlin, and then she just glances up at the screen, at us in the audience. That is a scene that builds excitement. That makes you want to just immediately go and watch the next episode. Like, that makes you feel like excited. It's like, where is this going? We now know these things. It's basically confirming it because she's looking up at the camera. I feel like the ending of the scene, while in a summary, it just doesn't have, like, it can't be communicated as well. It's amazing, and it makes you feel excitement and an urge to go and watch the next episode immediately. And so, our rewatching of the episode is completed, and it's time to move on to our rankings portion. On this channel, we rank on 2 lists. We rank on a mostly objective list. Mostly objective because while emotion is removed, bias and judgment still apply, and a personal ranking, which is purely based on emotion. So we have our mostly objective rank values, and I've highlighted those that apply. So we'll start with the only negative. Obviously, we have the failed emotional impact of Merlin's temporary death, because we all knew, watching, that there was no way they were killing the main character in episode 4. This isn't that type of show where they would do such a thing. We obviously didn't feel what we were supposed to feel when Merlin almost died, because we knew it wasn't real. So there was no real, like, it didn't hit. And that, of course, puts us into a -3. Balancing that out and bringing us back to 0 are the successful emotional impacts. Obviously, we have Uther crushing the flower that Arthur succeeded in bringing, and that just gave great emotions of anger and hatred at Uther. He was unforgivable. There was no grace to be given. He just proved himself to be an absolutely unreasonable a-hole. And then, of course, there's the looking into the, like, Nimue when she looks into the camera at the end, and that excitement and urge that you feel to go and watch the next episode. Obviously, that's an emotion. So they balance out a -3 and a +3, so we're back to 0. We then have, of course, one of the most memorable moments, which was the glowing orb. In order for me to consider something memorable, it has to be something that years out from your original watching or rewatching of the series, when you look back on the series, if it's one of those things that stuck into your mind that you think of right away, that is something that I would consider memorable. There are a lot of things that are memorable in the moment, but they don't really have the staying power to stick with you for years afterwards. So those things that do have that staying power, that's where the point, that those are the things that get the point. So in this case, obviously, the glowing orb, it stuck in my brain for years, and that is a +3 points. And then we have our multi-season main character growth, and that is Arthur. Arthur, of course, started out a bully, doesn't care about anybody but himself, very much narcissistic, very much he's superior to everyone. Turn away at the first inconvenience. In Valiant, he said he trusted him as soon as he was made a fool of. He fired Merlin immediately. He wasn't willing to stick around. Obviously, he was his dad's yes man. But now in this episode, we see that he's grown. He's now willing to defy his father. He's now willing to suffer inconvenience, and all for the sake of his servant, who is at this point starting to become his best friend. And so for that growth, that's +4 points. So that brings us to a total for this episode of 7 out of 10. So with a 7 out of 10, we now have our order for the episodes being in first place on our mostly objective ranking list, The Dragon's Call. Second place, Valiant. Third place, The Poison Chalice. And in fourth, we have The Mark of Nimue. My list is a little bit different. So, my personal ranking, this is one of my favorite episodes. It had a memorable moment, it elicited emotion in some places, I felt compelled to go and see the next episode immediately, it made me excited to see where we're going, and even Merlin's dumb outfit made me chuckle. Everything about this episode was great, and even like with Merlin's death, no, it didn't make me feel anything, but it didn't make me feel anything negative either. It was just kind of a non-entity. And so, because it is one of my favorite episodes, because I liked almost everything about it, I decided to give it a personal ranking of 10 out of 10. Which means that on my personal list, in first place, we have The Poison Chalice. Second place, The Dragon's Call. Third place, Valiant. And in fourth place, we have The Mark of Nimue. Now it's time for our series ranking. In the series ranking, we're ranking each season against each other, and the numbers that are scored in the initial ranking apply here and create the total score that we will then percentage out to find out exactly how well each season did, and once we've watched all of the seasons, we'll then know which ones were better. In this season, there's 13 episodes, which is allowing for a maximum score of 130. Our mostly objective rank was 7, so that brings us up to 26 out of 130 for our mostly objective ranking. And on the personal ranking side, we've now added 10 points, and that brings us up to a total of 28 out of 130. And with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Merlin Season 1, Episode 4, The Poisoned Chalice. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.